Katie McClintock. We'll advance the slide, with the Environmental Protection Agency as well. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the colored glass industry. So when we first got this information from the Forest Service and DEQ about the 2 glass plants that were in Portland being a problem, we of course were curious what else was going on, and we were a little concerned how many other glass plants there might be doing the same thing. Fortunately, Portland is quite the artist center location, so there were not 2 plants in every major city in the country, but we did find big manufacturing facilities in Spectrum, or in Washington, and some back east. And so it definitely shed light on an industry that I don't think anyone was paying as much attention to. They're not considered large sources generally. So what happened is as we got this MOS data in, then they, like Julie and Sarah have talked about, they set up the monitor, which confirmed that the emissions were a level of concern. From that point, we took a closer look at the facilities. Were they subject to any of the requirements that we have written into rule, either in the state level or the federal level? And what we determined was that there was a federal rule that we had published to deal with toxic air emissions, and these facilities had all considered themselves exempt from that rule based on an interpretation of a word. And so EPA was contacted by DEQ, the local authority, to say, is that exemption correct, or should they be subject to this rule? And EPA clarified that all of these sources would be subject, which would mean they would have to install controls or otherwise show that they could meet the limits established in the rule for some of the major metals, for chromium, cadmium, arsenic, lead, manganese, and nickel. So it has an effect on those metals. It also identified in general that this sector was a contributor to HAP emissions. The EPA doesn't set a requirement that local agencies, permit sources in any particular way. And so some sources, like Bullseye, actually did have a permit that recognized their overall operation but didn't focus on metal HAPs. And so what this allowed us to do is contact all the various permit agencies, let them know about the metal HAP emissions from these facilities, and examine those closer. This is an industry where there wasn't a lot of background scientific data on, if you make a ton of red glass, how many pounds of cadmium are you going to emit? And there is not a lot of data out there, so people weren't necessarily accurately reporting those emissions. So we investigated other sources, and it may lead to other future rule changes. As we understand a source sector more, it's always possible that that will allow us to tailor our rules better to address any environmental problems from them. This data in terms of overall use at DEQ, there were previous studies that DEQ had done, and I think Sarah referenced one in 2009, where they had identified air toxics as a problem in Portland, that there were certain metals that were of concern, but they could not find the source of those metals. What this MOS study did was really allow them to focus their efforts. The maps produced with the hotspots show you exactly where to look for a source. You still have to figure out who it is, but at least, allows you to put up a monitor and confirm, and then check, in a very small area what the sources might be. DEQ, since the first monitor showed issues, they have installed monitors around other hotspots that have been identified by the Forest Service, and I imagine as more maps come out, then more might be installed, and those have allowed them to continue to gather more real-time data about emissions in these areas. I think it's safe to say that the work done by this MOS study will have a substantial improvement in the air quality in Portland. If you're curious, you should read some articles about what's going on in Portland. It has actually catalyzed the community to be very involved about the sources in their area. Maybe people who didn't complain about issues are now complaining about issues, which is a good thing. It's getting everyone more involved in localized concerns about environmental impacts of sources. So that's, I think, really good. It's a lot of work for the Oregon DEQ, but I think it's really going to result in a good improvement. And then long term, as this came to light, it was pointed out that Oregon does not have a state toxics program. So if you wanted to build a source, there was nothing that required you to evaluate whether or not your source would have a health impact on the community around you. You would just have to show that you complied with any law or any rule that was published. So the EQ has now received, I think, $2.5 million to develop a program, both a regulatory program and staff to carry it out and to monitor for it, to actually assess toxic emissions from facilities, which is going to have a permanent impact on all sources in the state of Oregon going forward. This slide is just our thoughts for consideration. I mean, our overall assessment at EPA is that this has the potential to be a wonderful screening tool. It certainly needs to be developed further, as Sarah had mentioned, geographical issues, or, does it correlate to, what time period does it correlate to? What about other things that could affect it? But, in general, ambient monitoring, in addition to being expensive, as Sarah pointed out, it's susceptible to meteorological conditions. If you put out a monitor south of a facility and the wind does not blow towards the monitor, then you will not figure out, the impacts of that facility. And it's very limited. You put up a certain amount of time, into it, and you only get data for that, month maybe that you had the monitor, not sort of all operating conditions over a longer time frame. MOS also, we believe that it could provide a really useful screening tool in addition to monitors, and even source testing. I mean, we can test sources, but that's under one day, under one condition, and MOS provides, a potential multiple-year look. We also think it would be fascinating to explore the correlation of soil concentrations with MOS to see if you could predict soil impacts based on MOS data. We also think it would be interesting to compare MOS data with source testing data to try to do sort of source fingerprinting, if you will, to say, okay, there's this particular trace metal in a MOS, and we found that exact trace metal in a source, and so we can actually know, without even doing ambient monitoring, potentially who the contributing source is. That's something we can't do now, but it would be really interesting to see if we could, develop that kind of tool in the future. We're also hopeful that similar MOS studies in other cities might identify other key industries of concern. A look at Portland identified the stained glass industry and a few other smaller sources which might have other impacts as well. A study in Seattle or Cincinnati or whatever other city might identify another one, and each time we identify a source category or a new type of industry, that has a national impact as those effects trickle across the nation. So that would be, I think, a really good impact. I think, as I mentioned too, we, in addition to establishing a method for how one would carry this out, we would need to also look into the geographic limitations. Could you use this everywhere? How would EPA or anyone who wanted to do this kind of study know where to employ this technique and what the limitations on that technique are? We'd have to figure all that out. Current status, DEQ is continuing to monitor the air, as Julie mentioned, and this is the link to that if you are interested in seeing it. It's been fascinating to see the impacts, and like Julie said, I mean, it's clearly showing a substantial decrease in emissions. There actually are still hexavalent chromium emissions of a level of concern around the source without them using chromium, so Oregon is now even investigating further to figure out if there are other sources of hexavalent chromium, either chrome platers or rail yards that could have contributed. So it's allowing a very deep dive into the air quality in this particular. There's also public health assessment, as Julie mentioned, and they're investigating other contributors, whether it's this hexavalent one. There's an arsenic hotspot that we're not sure the contributor. And as the Forest Service continues to release maps, we will continue to be able to overlay those maps. Okay, we have a hotspot of chromium and arsenic in the same spot, so we are probably looking at a source that uses both compounds. So it will, I think, as we piece together all of the maps, it's really going to develop a very complex picture for us to use. So that is the end of our presentation. Thank you.